Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the vast Pacific expanse. The date was June 2, 1942, and the combined fleet's most ambitious operation was about to unfold. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the morning swells like steel predators, their flight decks bristling with the finest naval aircraft the Empire of Japan could muster. The morning sun reflected off the waves like scattered diamonds, but Yamamoto's mind was clouded with an unease he couldn't quite articulate. His war doctrine, refined through decades of naval strategy and proven triumphant from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, was about to face its ultimate test. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: strike Midway Atoll with overwhelming force, draw out the American Pacific Fleet, and destroy it in decisive battle. It was the same doctrine that had served Japan so well: concentrate superior force at the point of attack, achieve tactical surprise, and annihilate the enemy before they could respond effectively. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier-striking force from Akagi's bridge, his confidence buoyed by 6 months of uninterrupted victory. His pilots were the finest in the world, veterans of countless battles who had swept American, British, and Dutch forces from the Pacific with contemptuous ease. The Zero fighters were untouchable in air-to-air combat, the Kate torpedo bombers had proven their worth at Pearl Harbor, and the Valdive bombers could place their ordnance with surgical precision. Below decks, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida prepared his air crews for what he believed would be another routine operation. The man who had led the first wave against Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier moved among his pilots with quiet authority, reviewing target assignments and flight plans. The Americans at Midway would be caught completely off guard, just as they had been in Hawaii. The base would be destroyed, and when the American fleet arrived to investigate, it would sail directly into the jaws of the combined fleet's trap. Reference context drawn from Gordon Prang's Miracle at Midway regarding Japanese operational planning and command structure. But 800 miles to the northeast, on the cramped bridge of the aircraft carrier Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy forever. The Americans weren't sailing blindly into Yamamoto's trap. They were setting one of their own. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25, and every detail of Operation MI was known to the American command. Where Yamamoto expected to find surprise defenders and a hastily assembled relief force, he would instead encounter 3 American aircraft carriers positioned to strike at the most vulnerable moment. The Japanese war machine had grown drunk on its own success. Its commanders convinced that American morale had been permanently shattered by the string of defeats that followed Pearl Harbor. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had served Japan well in the confined waters of the Western Pacific, was about to collide with American determination and superior intelligence in the vast emptiness of the Central Pacific. As the Japanese fleet steamed toward what its commanders believed would be another glorious victory, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The trap was being baited, and neither side fully understood just how completely the other's calculations were about to be proven wrong. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, hung over the Pacific like a shroud as the first Japanese scout planes lifted off from their carriers. Commander Fuchida watched from Akagi's flight deck as the reconnaissance aircraft disappeared into the gloom, their mission to locate any American naval forces that might be lurking in the area. According to Japanese intelligence, the American carriers were still in the South Pacific, licking their wounds from the Coral Sea engagement weeks earlier. Admiral Nagumo paced the bridge of his flagship, supremely confident in his force's ability to execute the planned strikes against Midway. His 4 carriers held over 200 aircraft, manned by pilots whose skill had been proven in combat from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The morning's first wave would soften up the American defenses on the atoll, followed by a second strike that would complete the base's destruction. Any American fleet response would arrive too late to prevent Midway's fall and would sail directly into the killing zone of Yamamoto's battle line. The Japanese war doctrine had evolved from centuries of military tradition, emphasizing the decisive battle that would crush an enemy's will to fight in a single, overwhelming blow. It had worked perfectly against the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, and it had served Japan brilliantly in the opening months of the Pacific War. Speed, concentration of force, and tactical surprise were the pillars upon which Japanese naval strategy rested, and they had proven unshakable through victory after victory. But as the sun crept above the eastern horizon, the first cracks in this seemingly perfect doctrine began to appear. At 0530 hours, a Japanese scout reported sighting American ships northeast of Midway, though the initial message was maddeningly vague about their composition and exact location. More troubling still, American aircraft from Midway had already found the Japanese carriers and were beginning their attacks, though these early strikes were poorly coordinated and largely ineffective. Reference context sourced from Walter Lord's Incredible Victory regarding the breakdown in Japanese reconnaissance and communication. Unknown to Nagumo, Admiral Spruance had positioned Enterprise and Hornet exactly where they could do the most damage, while Admiral Frank Fletcher's Yorktown completed the American trap from the south. The American commanders had studied Japanese tactics extensively, learning from the disasters at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines. They understood that Japanese doctrine relied heavily on achieving surprise and maintaining the initiative, but Station Hypo's code breaking had stripped away the element of surprise entirely. The rigid Japanese command structure, which had proven so effective in earlier battles, now became a liability. Information flowed slowly up the chain of command, and critical decisions were delayed by the need for consensus among senior officers. When the first American torpedo bombers from Midway arrived over the Japanese fleet, they were slaughtered by Zero fighters and ship-mounted anti-aircraft fire, but their sacrifice bought precious time for the Americans to position their main striking force. Admiral Nagumo found himself caught between conflicting priorities as reports flooded into Akagi's bridge. His first-wave aircraft were returning from Midway, reporting that a second strike would be necessary to complete the base's neutralization. Simultaneously, the vague scout reports suggested American naval forces might be present in the area, though their strength and composition remained unclear. The Japanese war doctrine demanded concentration of force, but Nagumo suddenly found his force divided between multiple objectives as American pressure mounted from every direction. The trap that Admiral Yamamoto had so carefully laid for the American fleet was beginning to close around his own forces instead. The rigid adherence to predetermined battle plans, which had served Japan so well when fighting inferior opponents, now prevented rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The Americans weren't behaving according to Japanese expectations, and the machine-like precision of the combined fleet was about to encounter the one variable it couldn't accommodate, an enemy that refused to cooperate with its own destruction. At 07:15 on the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Standing in Akagi's flag bridge, surrounded by charts and radio reports, he stared at the tactical display that would determine the fate of Japan's carrier striking force. His returning first-wave aircraft were circling overhead, low on fuel and ammunition, while conflicting intelligence reports painted an increasingly chaotic picture of American naval forces somewhere to the northeast. The Japanese war doctrine that had guided the Imperial Navy to 6 months of unbroken victory suddenly seemed inadequate to address the complexity of the situation unfolding around Midway. Commander Fuchida, wounded during the return flight from the atoll, urged immediate preparation for a second strike against the island's defenses. The American base had proven more resilient than expected, with fighters and bombers continuing to launch despite the morning's bombardment. But at 0728, everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally transmitted a clear report. Have sighted 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The message electrified Nagumo's staff, but the critical question remained unanswered. Were these ships carriers or merely cruisers and destroyers? The doctrine demanded concentration of force against the primary threat, but which threat took priority? Nagumo's hesitation would prove fatal to Japanese naval supremacy. Trained in the rigid command structure that had served Japan so well in previous conflicts, he found himself paralyzed by the need to make rapid tactical adjustments without clear guidance from higher authority. The war doctrine that emphasized careful planning and overwhelming force concentration had no provision for the kind of split-second decision-making required when facing an equally determined and well-prepared enemy. Reference context taken from Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya's Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, regarding command decision-making during the critical morning hours. While Nagumo wrestled with his dilemma, the American trap was tightening with mechanical precision. Admiral Spruance had launched his strike force from Enterprise and Hornet at 0702, sending every available aircraft toward the Japanese carriers. The American doctrine, learned painfully through early defeats, emphasized aggressive action over careful preparation. Where Japanese commanders sought perfect intelligence and overwhelming superiority, American leaders were willing to gamble on partial information and calculated risks. The cultural differences between the two naval philosophies became starkly apparent as the morning wore on. Japanese staff officers debated the proper response to conflicting intelligence while precious minutes ticked away. The doctrine of consensus decision-making, which ensured careful consideration of all factors, now prevented rapid response to changing circumstances. Every minute of delay gave the Americans more time to position their striking force for maximum effect. At 0830, Nagumo finally received confirmation that the American force included at least one carrier. He immediately ordered his aircraft to be rearmed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship attack, reversing the earlier decision to prepare for a second strike against Midway. But the constant changes in armament had consumed nearly 2 hours, and his flight decks were cluttered with fuel lines, ordnance, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. The Japanese war doctrine's emphasis on methodical preparation, which had served so well in previous battles, now became a liability as American dive bombers approached from the northeast. The rigid adherence to proper procedures meant that Nagumo's carriers were caught in their most vulnerable configuration. Flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, damage control parties occupied with routine maintenance, and no combat air patrol at proper altitude to defend against high-level attack. The trap that had seemed so perfectly designed to destroy American naval power was about to snap shut on its creators instead. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese war doctrine that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was about to die in flames over the blue waters northwest of Midway. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the white wakes of the Japanese fleet far below and pushed his aircraft into a screaming dive toward the carrier Kaga. The scene on the Japanese flight decks was one of organized chaos that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Admiral Nagumo's constant changes in strike preparation had left all 4 carriers in their most vulnerable condition. Armed aircraft spotted for launch, fuel lines snaking across the decks, and ordnance scattered in neat rows awaiting installation. The methodical Japanese procedures that had served so well in previous battles now created a perfect storm of combustible material waiting for the American attack. Commander Fuchida watched in horror from Akagi's bridge as the first American dive bombers rolled over into their attack runs. The Zero Combat Air Patrol that had so effectively slaughtered the earlier American torpedo attacks was now caught at sea level, unable to climb rapidly enough to intercept the high-altitude dive bombers. The rigid Japanese doctrine of maintaining standing combat air patrol had been compromised by the need to land returning aircraft and the confusion of conflicting strike preparations. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:24, detonating among the aircraft spotted on her flight deck and igniting fires that spread with terrifying speed. Within moments, secondary explosions began tearing through the ship as aviation gasoline and armed ordnance created an inferno that no damage control party could contain. The carrier that had helped devastate Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was transformed into a floating crematorium in less than 5 minutes. Reference context drawn from Robert Ballard's Return to Midway regarding the specific timing and effects of the dive bomber attacks. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led his section of Enterprise bombers against Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck near the bridge and exploded among the aircraft being prepared for launch. Admiral Nagumo, the man who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, stood transfixed as his flagship became an inferno around him. The war doctrine that had seemed so invincible now proved helpless against an enemy that struck from an unexpected direction at precisely the right moment. The third Japanese carrier, Soryu, fell victim to bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. The American doctrine of divided command, which Japanese strategists had always considered a weakness, now proved its flexibility as 3 separate carrier air groups converged on the Japanese fleet from different directions. Where Japanese doctrine demanded unified command and coordinated action, the Americans had achieved devastating effect through independent initiative and aggressive execution. Within the space of 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had terrorized the Pacific were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal and their aircraft either destroyed or trapped below decks by spreading fires. The doctrine of decisive battle had indeed produced a decisive result, but not the one Japanese planners had envisioned. The concentrated striking force that was supposed to annihilate American naval power had instead presented a concentrated target for American revenge. Only Hiryu remained operational, and her captain immediately launched a desperate counterattack against the American carriers. The Japanese doctrine still demanded offensive action even in the face of catastrophic losses, and the surviving aircraft fought with the courage and skill that had made them legendary throughout the Pacific. But the strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Americans, and no amount of individual heroism could restore Japan's position. The morning that had begun with such confidence for the Japanese fleet was ending in disaster that would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The war doctrine that had seemed so perfectly adapted to modern naval combat was revealed as brittle and inflexible when confronted by an enemy that refused to follow the expected script. The afternoon sun of June 4th beat down mercilessly on the burning hulks that had once been the pride of the Japanese Navy. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, stood on the destroyer Nowaki after being evacuated from the blazing Akagi. Around him, the remnants of the Kido Butai, the carrier-striking force that had seemed invincible just hours earlier, struggled desperately to maintain some semblance of offensive capability. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, embodied the fighting spirit that had carried the Imperial Navy to its string of early victories. Despite witnessing the destruction of 3 sister ships, he immediately ordered strikes against the American carriers that had been located northeast of his position. The Japanese war doctrine demanded offensive action regardless of circumstances, and Kaku was determined to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, even as his own force disintegrated around him. At 14:30, 18 Japanese dive bombers and 6 fighters from Hiryu found the American carrier Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. 3 bombs struck Admiral Fletcher's flagship, causing serious damage and forcing the evacuation of non-essential personnel. For a brief moment, it seemed the rigid Japanese doctrine of never yielding the offensive might salvage something from the morning's disaster. But the American response revealed how completely the balance of naval power had shifted in the Pacific. where Japanese doctrine emphasized the preservation of elite units and irreplaceable experienced personnel, American industrial capacity and training programs had created a depth of resources that could absorb losses and continue fighting. The damage to Yorktown, while serious, did not cripple American striking power as similar losses would have affected the Japanese. Reference context sourced from John Lundstrom's The First Team regarding Japanese afternoon counterstrikes and American damage control capabilities. At 1645, the final act of the Midway tragedy began as American dive bombers from Enterprise located the Hiryu and delivered the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sister ships in the morning. Captain Kaku watched his flight deck erupt in flames and knew that Japan's era of naval supremacy had ended. The war doctrine that had promised decisive victory through concentrated carrier strikes had instead delivered decisive defeat through the same concentration that made his force vulnerable to coordinated enemy attack. The cultural rigidity that had been Japan's strength in earlier battles now hastened the fleet's destruction. Damage control procedures, while efficient, could not cope with the massive fires caused by aviation gasoline and armed ordnance exploding simultaneously on multiple ships. The doctrine of fighting to the last man, admirable in its dedication, prevented early evacuation of personnel who might have served in future battles. Every Japanese carrier captain chose to go down with his ship, taking irreplaceable experience and leadership to the bottom of the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles to the west, finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster as radio reports filtered in throughout the afternoon. The combined fleet that had seemed capable of challenging American industrial might now lay in ruins northwest of Midway, its carrier aviation decimated and its aura of invincibility shattered forever. The war doctrine that had promised to bring the Americans to their knees in a single decisive engagement had instead exposed the fatal weaknesses in Japanese strategic thinking. The rigid adherence to predetermined plans, the inability to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances, and the concentration of irreplaceable assets in vulnerable formations had all contributed to the catastrophe. Where American commanders had shown flexibility and willingness to accept calculated risks, Japanese leadership had remained bound by doctrine, even when that doctrine led to disaster. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the wreckage of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers marked more than just a tactical defeat. It represented the end of Japan's ability to dictate the terms of the Pacific War. The doctrine that had promised quick victory through superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence lay in ruins alongside the burning ships, and the long, grinding war of attrition that Japanese leaders had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. The pre-dawn hours of June 5, 1942, found Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato, staring at radio messages that detailed the complete destruction of his carrier striking force. In the space of 24 hours, the combined fleet had lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 200 naval aircraft, and, most critically, the irreplaceable pilots who had spearheaded Japan's early victories. The war doctrine that had promised to bring America to the negotiating table through a series of decisive battles had instead guaranteed a prolonged conflict that Japan could not win. The magnitude of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses. The Japanese Naval Air Force, built painstakingly over 2 decades and honed to perfection in the crucible of combat, had been effectively destroyed in a single day. The doctrine that emphasized the cultivation of elite units and superior individual skill had created a force that could not be quickly replaced when faced with catastrophic losses. American industrial capacity and training programs, previously dismissed by Japanese strategists as inferior to their own methods, now revealed their true strength. Captain Watanabe of the destroyer Tanakaze, one of the few Japanese officers to witness both the morning disaster and survive to file a complete report, later described the scene as the death of Japanese naval aviation. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had not simply been sunk, They had been annihilated so completely that rescue operations could save only a fraction of their crews. The doctrine of fighting to the death, while preserving Japanese honor, had also ensured that experienced personnel went down with their ships rather than living to fight another day. Admiral Spruance, now in tactical command of the American forces following damage to Yorktown, chose not to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet during the night hours. This decision, controversial at the time, actually demonstrated the superiority of the American command philosophy over its Japanese counterpart. Where Japanese doctrine would have demanded immediate pursuit regardless of circumstances, American tactical flexibility allowed for consolidation of gains and preservation of force for future operations. Reference context taken from Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II regarding post-battle analysis and strategic implications. The broader implications of Midway's outcome became clear as both sides assessed their losses and remaining capabilities. Japan's industrial capacity, already stretched by the demands of maintaining forces across the vast Pacific theater, could not quickly replace the lost carriers or their aircraft. More critically, the training programs that had produced Japan's elite naval aviators required years to complete, time that Japan no longer possessed as American strength continued to grow. The war doctrine that had served Japan so well during the period of rapid expansion now proved disastrously unsuited to a prolonged conflict against an industrial democracy. The emphasis on qualitative superiority over quantitative strength, perfect under conditions where Japan could choose the time and place of battle, became a fatal weakness when forced to fight on American terms. The concentrated striking force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had proven vulnerable to the same concentration of force when applied by a determined enemy. Admiral Yamamoto's strategic vision, which had correctly predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year before American industrial strength became decisive, now faced its ultimate test. The window of opportunity that Midway was supposed to extend had instead slammed shut with devastating finality. The combined fleet that steamed away from the battle scene on June 5th was still formidable in battleships and cruisers, but it lacked the carrier aviation necessary to project power across the vast Pacific distances. The Japanese war doctrine, refined through decades of careful study and proven in numerous victories, had failed its ultimate test not through any inherent flaw in its tactical application, but through its inability to adapt to strategic circumstances that its creators had never envisioned. The trap that had been so carefully laid for American naval power had instead caught its creators, and the consequences would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. 6 months after Midway, Admiral Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi, reviewing after-action reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Japan's strategic position. The war doctrine that had promised swift victory through decisive naval engagement had delivered decisive defeat instead, and the empire now found itself trapped in exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that Japanese military planners had desperately sought to avoid. The Battle of Midway had exposed the fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking with brutal clarity. The doctrine of decisive battle, inherited from Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, assumed that Japan would face enemies willing to commit their entire fleet to a single engagement. The Americans had indeed committed their fleet at Midway, but they had done so with superior intelligence, better tactical position, and the industrial capacity to absorb losses that would cripple their opponents. The rigid command structure that had served Japan so well during the period of rapid expansion now proved incapable of adapting to changing strategic circumstances. Where American military doctrine emphasized flexibility and initiative at lower command levels, Japanese doctrine demanded strict adherence to predetermined plans, even when those plans led to disaster. The very precision that had made Japanese forces so effective in earlier battles became a liability when facing an enemy that refused to cooperate with its own destruction. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from wounds received during the battle, spent his convalescence writing a detailed analysis of the Midway disaster for the Naval General Staff. His report, classified and largely ignored by senior commanders, identified the critical weaknesses that American intelligence and tactics had exploited so effectively. The concentration of carrier forces that had been Japan's strength had also created a concentrated target for enemy attack. The emphasis on offensive action had left Japanese forces vulnerable to defensive preparations they had not anticipated. Reference context drawn from Hiroyuki Agawa's The Reluctant Admiral, regarding post-Midway strategic assessments and doctrinal reviews. The industrial implications of Midway's outcome became increasingly apparent as 1942 progressed into 1943. American shipyards were launching new aircraft carriers at a rate that Japanese industry could not match, while American training programs were producing replacement pilots faster than Japan could train experienced aviators. The war doctrine that had dismissed American industrial capacity as irrelevant to naval combat was proven catastrophically wrong as the balance of power shifted inexorably against Japan. By early 1943, the strategic initiative had passed completely to the United States. The Guadalcanal campaign, which might have been a minor tactical engagement under different circumstances, became a grinding battle of attrition that Japan could not afford to lose, but lacked the resources to win decisively. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had promised quick victory through superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence, was replaced by the grim reality of resource warfare that favored American industrial capacity. Admiral Yamamoto's death in April 1943, when his aircraft was intercepted by American fighters over Bougainville, symbolized the complete collapse of the strategic vision that had launched Japan into war with the United States. The man who had warned against a prolonged conflict with America's industrial might was killed by the very forces he had hoped to neutralize through decisive naval action at Midway. The war doctrine that had failed so completely at Midway continued to haunt Japanese military planning throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The emphasis on qualitative superiority over quantitative strength, the rigid adherence to predetermined tactical plans, and the inability to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances all contributed to an unbroken series of defeats that culminated in Japan's surrender in August 1945. The trap that Admiral Yamamoto had so carefully constructed at Midway had indeed been sprung, but it was Japanese naval supremacy that lay crushed in its steel jaws. The war doctrine that had seemed so perfectly adapted to modern naval combat was revealed as inflexible and ultimately fatal when confronted by an enemy that combined superior intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility into an unstoppable force. The Battle of Midway had not simply sunk 4 aircraft carriers. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, and with it, Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific.